You look as
Go
though
into
you've
live
got a
stream.
whole array of monitors the way you scan, Mark.
I do. I have 4.
So you're recording to your own channel, are you?
Yeah, I'm just doing it now.
It's going now.
Excellent.
Yep. Do you want the link
Okay,
in
so-
the panelists? Do you want the link at all or not?
Yeah, might as well. Yes, put it in. If you put it in the
WhatsApp?
panelist chat or
Okay.
WhatsApp or whatever.
Yeah, fine, whatever. Done. Oh god, it's got a photo. It's got a still image of me. That's scary.
Right. Okay. So then, shall we do a few noddies?
Yeah.
So I
It's
guess
just-
we go into speaker view.
We are in speaker view.
Okay. So if I try and take control, which I can't see me here. Am I in full screen?
Yep.
A little smile. I'm good with that. Next.
Okay.
So we've got Guy now. How do we cut him up? How do we cut
You need
Guy?
to talk, Guy. If you start
Okay,
talking.
okay, I'll say something and then I'll belt up for a second.
I'm good with that. Now, Glenn.
Okay. I'll do my best, Blue Steel.
That's good with me. Thank you.
Right.
I rarely use them, but they're useful to have them.
Yeah.
Good. So, so Simon, we're pretty well ready to rock and roll, aren't we?
We are.
How many people are you expecting, Simon?
Sorry?
How many people are you expecting?
Last I heard, there were 61 registered.
Okay,
77 I saw.
Oh, right.
good.
It's more than John Mayer got last night on his rant.
So just to be clear, Simon, what will happen is I will mute everybody else. Tim, can you kill your video? That'd
I'll
be
kill the
great.
video and yeah.
Yep. And I'll mute everybody else, and you'll do the intro, and then I'll mute you and unmute Guy, and then Guy can start sharing his presentation.
Okay,
Sorry,
I
say
will
that
be
again?
I'll be starting with the screen share. The webinar will start shortly. 30 seconds. I'll share screen just before we go live.
Fine.
Sorry, Mark, I didn't quite catch what you said there about my screen share.
If you could screen share when you start talking, Guy, that'd be great.
Oh, I see. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It always seems to take a little bit of time, doesn't it, with this system?
Yep. And I'll count in.
If I was back in my directing days, I would say to the floor manager at Simon's Inn, for God's sake, get all that shit out the back of shot.
This is my life at the moment. Had the people around moving furniture today, so there was all of my mother's stuff is disappearing.
It does actually look tidier, I think, than last time I saw you in there.
Yeah, I've set dressed a little for today.
What's
This
your
is not-
lighting, Glenn? You've got an interesting. You've got a blue light onto the back, haven't you?
That's a Philips Hue strip light, one of the, the kind of.
Oh right. Oh yeah. Because your skin tone is fine. So.
There's a key light directly over my head, though.
You are. I've got a key light here, but I never have it switched on because I find it burns out with this HD camera. it has got some racking on it, but I've never managed to get it to work properly,
Yeah,
or not to rack it like a proper camera.
it's only 150 watt, and yet it's at its lowest setting. It's like 10%, and even at that, I'm right at the edge of burning out. So
These are unbelievable, these cameras, aren't they? I sit here without the lights on as the sun goes down, and you just see incredible definition when there's hardly any light in the room. And I mean, I used to, when we were covering cricket, you used to find it was so deceptive because, you know, the latest cameras, you could really rack them up and it looked like daylight. You looked out the truck and you could hardly see the other side of the field.
amazing.
Right, so in the chat to panelists, there is the link to the ordinary meeting if you want to start one up, Mark, after the event.
Yeah, I can start it for sure.
And everyone else, if you make a copy of those numbers, you can get in.
Or we just dial that into Zoom.
Yeah. 884, etc. And the password is along the 405 number on the end. Right, I'm just going to go to the loo.
5 minutes, guys.
That's the old trick the journalists used to do. They'd always do that to worry the director. When I worked at Bush House in the World Service, when I started in the Beep, you used to get people, you were supposed to ring up the duty manager if there was no one there 5 minutes to go. And the old hands would always check you out, and they'd stroll in about literally a minute to go. And then they'd say, you want a bit of level? And they'd read 2 lines, and then there'd probably be about 15 seconds before the red light. You got to know, but when you were young, when you were new, and they'd always watch, they say, you were about to ring, weren't you? I said, I've already rung. And the duty manager would normally say, oh, it's Peter Lewis, is it? Yeah, he'll be there, don't worry. Because at Bush House, those red lights were automatic. There was, if you were on the language services, there was no continuity. So they just came on the hour and it went live to transmitter. So it wasn't as though there was any human intervention in continuity that could help you out. Right, I'll go mute now.
Thanks, Tim.
Right, well, a couple of minutes, I think just over a couple of minutes to go.
We are indeed.
It's exciting, all this stuff, isn't it? Make sure my phone is
Excuse me.
1 minute to go. I will mute everybody else apart from Simon.
You're starting at 17:30, yeah? 30 seconds mark, yeah?
16:59, 30 seconds. So we're going to start, yeah?
Excellent. Okay. Good afternoon. In November 1970, Paul Kantner and his band Jefferson Starship released the album Blows Against the Empire. Its themes seem oddly prescient for today. The song Mau Mau, for example, contains a meme that is particularly appropriate. The idea that Tyrannosaurus Rex was destroyed by a furry little ball that crawled across the primeval jungle floor. He stole the eggs of the dinosaur. These were the egg snatchers, and though comparatively tiny, they survived the end of that multi-million-year dynasty. In the year 2000, Netflix finally got the meeting with blockbusters they've been after for ages. They saw benefit in joining forces and bringing their online expertise to the union. However, blockbusters laughed in their faces, saying that dot-com hysteria was overblown, and that went well for blockbusters. Throughout history, inferior products have entered markets, improved, and then displaced market leaders who thought themselves invulnerable. This process was described by a Harvard academic, Clayton Christensen. Christensen called this disruptive innovation, and we're going to explore the concept in relation to the media and particularly to news. So welcome to this RTS Thames Valley Technology Centre webinar about disruptive innovation in the media industries. There will be a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat or put your hand up. We'll try to connect as many as possible into the discussion. So let's hear from two people who experienced some of the best dinosaur years of the media. Today, we're joined by Guy Pelham and Glenn Mulcahy, both experienced leaders in broadcast television. First is Guy. He was a senior executive at BBC News from 1993 until 2013, when he left to set up the Guy Pelham Media Consultancy. At the BBC, he led several innovation projects that helped change the way news is gathered, amongst which smartphones, 3 and 4G bonding for live reporting, and lightweight satellite communications for field production. Guy.
Well, thanks very much, Simon. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And as you say, I spent most of my career at BBC News, but the last few years were definitely the most interesting. And why was that? Well, because I had pretty much a license to do things differently. My job was to make sure that BBC News didn't get beaten by rivals who had better kit or had better ideas of how to do things. And so one or two of them you've mentioned, but this one was smartphones for news gathering, led to some interesting times here. I mean, smartphones are everywhere now, but this was the first live via a mobile phone in September 2004 from the beach at Dover about cross-channel ferries. Not a world-shaking story, but it was the start of things to come technically. Bonding kit you've mentioned. This was, for those of you who aren't familiar with this technology, essentially it's a box of tricks that goes on the back of a camera and which contains enough mobile phone SIMs to create a broadband path fast enough for live video. And it also hoovers up Wi-Fi and all kinds of connectivity these days. But this was the first one. This was the 2010 election, and it was the Lib Dem battle bus. And we went live from it as we went around the country. So that was the kind of thing I got up to. I guess the last thing I did was move news gathering, the BBC's news making arm, if you like, into a shiny new building, which you'll recognize there. I don't mention it because it was a Pickford's lift and shift move. It was actually quite transformational in the sense that in one building you had not only TV, radio, and online working together, but you also had international, national, and local regional news in one place. So it meant lots of people doing things really differently. For a block of concrete, it was disruptively innovative, I would say. Not least because a lot of people didn't want to go there in the first place. So this, I guess, is the way we used to do news. A hugely expensive kit manned by dozens of expensive people. Hardworking people too, but expensive. So obviously that model has been disrupted. And let's just go quickly through some of the things that do act upon the status quo. So the first one is very obviously money. And it's generally the number one factor in innovation, more precisely the lack of money, because I would say companies that are flush with money, flush with cash, usually fail to innovate because they're making enough money from the existing business model. So why would they innovate? It's the lean, hungry outsiders who do things differently. Big companies tend to turn to innovation when they absolutely have to, with one or two exceptions. One I was very much struck by listening to Glenn actually interviewing somebody from Kodak, who was a lens developer, and they developed some pretty cool smartphone lenses. They had the expertise, they had the production capacity, they had everything, but they never sold any. And why? Because film paid the bills. Other things that essentially caused that disruptive innovation, politics. Politics is a real disruptor. BBC's having massive budget problems right now, not least because of political decisions around the fact that they had to take on the World Service budget and the over 75 license fee. And they've also got political problems with outside innovation, Andrew Neil's GB News, for example, and maybe Paul Dacre turning up at Ofcom, you know, things that are seriously going to disrupt their way of doing things. Social media is not immune to this either. Obviously, what's been happening with Facebook in Australia right now is a classic case in point, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk more about that later in the session. Audience. If the audience suddenly disappears, that's pretty disruptive. And obviously it has with newspapers a couple of decades ago, and obviously it's happening now with linear TV and a younger demographic. A crisis. Has there been a crisis lately? I think there probably has. The last year has been one long crisis, and that forces change. Wars, pandemics, you name it, they force change. And I guess finally, I would say invention, or more precisely, not invention, but innovation. I'll come on and talk about this in a moment, but essentially when you get a bunch of inventions all happening together is when you get real disruptive innovation, and which destroys your old model. Too often, the status quo, the companies and the organizations that essentially control the status quo, they're like a frog in a pot. I know Simon likes his analogy with the dinosaurs and the eggs. I'm the frog in the pot guy. And essentially what happens, the frog is sitting quite happily in the pot, and somebody lights a flame underneath it, and very slowly the water gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually the frog boils to death. Of course, if he jumped out at the beginning, he would be a live, happy frog. And there are a number of companies that essentially have failed to jump out the pot in time. And Kodak I've mentioned already, but famously Nokia and BlackBerry, and there's a bit of high street going on there. MySpace, who remembers MySpace? Xerox crashed and burned. Simon's already mentioned Blockbuster. Motorola went south in the mobile phone market as well. So all of these guys could have jumped when they had a moment, and they failed to take it when confronted with disruptive innovation. So what's the biggest obstacle to change? Well, I would say it's people. I mean, money and all the other factors do play a role. Yes, for sure they do. But in our line of work, I think the thing that derails change faster and more effectively than anything else is people. I mean, nobody likes change. That's pretty much a given. But I guess we pride ourselves on being an industry which is creative, is resourceful, it never takes no for an answer. But I tell you, it's astonishingly conservative when it comes to technology. This is what you hear. I just want it to work. You know, I've heard that more times than I can shake a stick at. I don't want to take any chances. My piece has got to make, my program's got to be ready. I can't take any chances. I'm certainly not going to take any chances with your fancy Dan new kit. And I remember quite clearly one desk editor saying to me when I was trying to push him to use a piece of kit that I really thought would make a difference. And he said, well, let me put it this way. If your fancy piece of kit works, you get all the credit. But if it goes wrong, I get all the shit. And you kind of have to see his point. What was in it for him? Not very much. He was much more comfortable with the old way of doing things. So can you achieve disruptive innovation from within? Well, I guess, yeah, you can. There are one or two examples. I mean, John Burt launching the BBC into online is a classic example of somebody innovating from a position of strength and from within. But the key thing I would say, if you are looking to innovate from within an organization, the key thing is to get buy-in from the boss of bosses, the capo di capi. Because if you don't, everybody that you've annoyed the hell out of with your new way of doing things just rushes off, talks to the boss and says, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And they'll put forward some really persuasive arguments which will hold you below the waterline. So always get buy-in from the boss. Who are these key stakeholders? Dreadful phrase, but who are the people who can mess up your plan? Devise a strategy to cope with each one. And the key thing I would say is identify your pioneers. Now, there are people in every organization who are willing to take a risk. They're willing to run the risk of making themselves look a bit stupid if something goes wrong while they're on air. They're willing to take a risk that their program might not come off in quite the way they're intended. The key thing is there are not very many of them. There's only about 10%, and that's my guesstimate from my personal experience, about 10% of the workforce. People who are really reliable, the go-to people when you want to make something work. And the final thing I would say in how to do this from within is nothing succeeds like success. If your fancy damn bit of kit is right in the right place at the right time and really delivers the goods, particularly if nobody else is around, then you instantly shortcut all the nonsense, and all you have to do is say, well, it worked last time, and everybody goes, yeah, it did actually, didn't it? And suddenly your opposition melts away. The Spitfire, why is there a picture of a Spitfire here? Well, it's to make a point really about innovation and invention. The Spitfire, everybody knows about the Battle of Britain, great national myth, the few, fight them on the beaches, all that. But the Spitfire was actually a center of a perfect storm of technology. It was groundbreaking from that perspective. So it was metal. It was a monoplane. That meant you could put loads of guns in it to shoot down the opposition in a way that you could never have done with a biplane. You could put a socking great engine in it so you could fly faster. Radar was invented so you could spot the enemy coming. Radio was used so the pilots could talk to each other and talk to base. All those things together caused disruptive innovation. And I talked earlier about the bonding kit. Exactly the same thing happened there. It wasn't just one guy saying, I've worked out a way of putting lots of SIMs in a box. It was much more complicated, and that required other things to happen. First of all, IP had to exist, the ability to move video over broadband. You had to have much better compression in order to achieve decent pictures at very low bit rates. And then you needed the connectivity. It needed to be out there. You needed 3G, you needed 4G, you needed Wi-Fi, and eventually, of course, you'll get 5G, which, again, another game changer. But I guess that's the thing. It's not just one invention, it's a wodge of inventions all happening at the same time, creating genuine innovation. Finally, I'd just like to talk about innovation being the death of the specialist. Innovation usually means somewhere a specialist dies. Back in the day, it was the tape editor. Remember them? Only they could work their magic. And now anybody can do it. Technology has become democratized and it's available to everybody. I'm not sure how many TikTok users we've got in tonight, but here's a screen grab from a TikTok screen. And essentially on that one interface, you can shoot video, you can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can add color, you can add text, you can add filters, emoticons, flip it, do whatever you want with it just by tapping and upload it to anywhere in the world. And I guess whether it's any good or not, of course, is another matter. And also I'd say in a world where innovation is everywhere, how do you make your version special? And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that. Finally, I'd say no presentation about innovation is complete without a pithy quote. And here's mine. This is John Maynard Keynes, economist. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from the old ones. So that's it from me. I look forward to the Q&A and the chat, and of course, Glenn.
Thank you, Guy. Next, we have Glenn Mulcahy, who started broadcast news in 1997 at what became TG4 in Ireland. He then took on the role of Head of Innovation at RTE. He left RTE in 2018 to establish his independent events and training business, Titanium Media. He's travelled all over the globe teaching mobile journalism and is a regular speaker at conferences. Glenn.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute, Simon. And great to hear Guy again. It's been a few years since we've actually kind of really crossed paths in person, and COVID hasn't helped that much, but brilliant fascination with that presentation, Guy. And in many ways, the points that you've made lead very nicely actually into some of the messages that I guess I have as well. So I'll dive straight in with sharing my screen as well. And hopefully you can see that. I'll just go full screen. Can you just get a thumbs up to make sure that everyone can actually see that presentation? Yeah. Okay, we'll get a nod from Guy. So I'll give you a very, very short bit of background on me as well. So as Simon has rightly said, about 20 years in the broadcast business, most of it spent in news. I've gone through a few different phases of disruption and innovation over that time. In fact, in many ways, I was very fortunate to start my career with TG Cahir. It's an Irish language TV station in Ireland, so I doubt many of you have necessarily heard of it. But what was very special about it is when it was founded in 1996, it was at one of those points of convergence that Guy has spoken about. It was at that point where server technology had gotten to the point that you could use it for playout. You could also tap into that server technology for desktop editing. And actually, the journalists who were all fresh out of college, actually, back in 1996, they were exposed to this brand new technology, which allowed them to do desktop class editing for the reports. They were still being shot on beta SP tape, by the way, but they were being captured and ingested by the journalists, self-edited, and then pushed to broadcast over IP. So that was 1996. It was pretty early, and it was an amazing environment to come in and learn as a broadcast engineer, as I was then. I'm not going to lie either, though. It was such new technology that my job as an engineer was really firefighting, trying to keep the station on air. If I had to reset computers once a day, it was probably 40 to 50 times a day. And there was a rolling joke about how long did we spend on black on air today. It was the Wild West in every sense. TG Cahir is on the absolute extremity of west of Ireland. And I think RT was very happy to have that bit of landmass between the two so they could do all the testing in the West Coast. But that's where I cut my teeth. I moved to Donnybrook in 2008 to the main RTE newsroom, though I had been working for RTE News in the West Coast for several years beforehand, where I managed studios and managed camera crews. And again, part of that role was overseeing the adoption of the transition from Beta SP to DVC Pro. And you might remember those LT85 laptop editors. I'll show a slide in a second to recap that. And then the transition to editing with Avid Media Composer on laptops. So been through a few phases of innovation, but the one that has really, really caught my attention, and the one I want to spend the few minutes I have with you talking about today, is the one that has not yet fully come of age. Well, I think it probably has. It just hasn't been adopted in earnest. And I think we're either potentially missing a huge trick or maybe forced to look at it very, very seriously going forward. So let's dive in. I've put some contact information up there if someone wants to reach out and argue some of the points I made. You're more than welcome to do so, but let's get into the presentation. So phases of change within the content creation market, if you like. My very first gig was actually on a film set, a movie set. Roger Corman had decided to set up a studio in the west of Ireland, and I got a break by becoming a PA to locations, but it was the first time I saw a full 35 millimeter cinema filmmaking process. And that was an amazing experience. And in many ways, that's what kind of baited me to say, I'm going to work in media no matter what happens. So as I said, I was there for the transition in the newsroom from Beta SP to DVC Pro, and in between we obviously had DV kind of coming on stream at the same time. I've also witnessed obviously the transition from disc-based like XD Cam into DSLRs, which are around just over 11 years now, and running parallel to that DSLR evolution, there's also been the mobile revolution. But in many ways, it's still, I believe, understated as a professional capture tool. And that's a bit of what I want to try and unpack for you here now. So that's the acquisition side, if you like, the filming side. But the editing side has obviously transitioned over that same time as well. So we've gone from tape splicing on Steenbecks all the way onto DVC Pro tape-to-tape editors that were portable, as long as you did a bit weightlifting. And then we moved on to Media Composer on laptops. And again, we now have desktop class editing, I would argue, on mobile devices. So what's actually happened is, whereas up until now, everything else has been a discrete kind of, this is how you shoot, this is how you edit, suddenly all these things are converging in one device. And that's what I think that is incredibly exciting about it. So let's just do a compare and contrast between the traditional model and what I think is potentially, well, it's here now. It's not next. It's actually what's evolving as we speak. The typical ENG newsroom setup, most big broadcasters, RTE being case in point here, will spend equally anywhere between 40 and 60,000 euros on their ENG camera kits. And depending on the size of your organization, you might be buying 20 of these, or you might be buying 200 of these. So it is a very, very substantial investment. Within all that kit, obviously, we have top of the range XD Cam camera. We have professional, dual channel redundant audio. We have top of the range Apple Mac with Avid Media Composer on it, lighting kits, not even including the Jeep that the crews usually get. And I'm not going to talk about salaries at all. We're just going to talk about the kit. So it's quite a big investment, and we do it because we aspire to the best possible quality. We want to uphold European Broadcasting Union standards, obviously, for transmission, and it all fits into a single ecosystem. That ecosystem is the shared experience that people consume predominantly on television at home, though of course a lot of the content is repackaged, we'll say, for both the web and for social. There is a big question about whether the storytelling translates directly across. I would argue it doesn't. I think social is a storytelling format in its own right, and I think mobile is very well suited to produce content for that. Now, one thing I did want to talk to you about was the idea of the decline in audience, something that Guy has already touched on. There was a metric in RT 2-3 years ago when I left, which was that year on year, we were seeing between a 4 and 5% annual decline in viewership for the linear evening bulletin. Still the most watched show on Irish television in a news sense, but nonetheless, that was a fairly alarming decline in viewership. A lot of the people were going to VOD or catch up or the website, or RT's website, particularly the news section, was always year on year the most website visited in Ireland. The bizarre thing about it is that COVID, for all of its ills, all of its disruption, all of its impacts, it's actually created a kind of a mini boom for TV news because people are obviously quarantined at home and, clearly suffering, many people suffering with depression and feelings of claustrophobia and frustration and this real shortage of credible, believable, trustworthy news. So this is where the big brands are, where people go to know that what you're going to hear is right, because we have the echo chambers of Facebook that are seeding misinformation left, right, and center, and clearly not doing a very, very good job of managing it. And that's a point that I'm going to circle back to a little bit later in the conversation. However, in the not too distant future, we will get past COVID. And to a certain extent, the real question from what I'm raising here is, will we revert to type, or will we start to see the opportunities that we've been forced to take as a new pathway for a more sustainable kind of a business model? So we all know the metaphor has been used for newspapers for years. today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chips wrapper. To a certain extent, news content is relatively ephemeral. It's got a very, very short shelf life. And this news that we broadcast today is very, very unlikely to be rebroadcast. The story may evolve, of course, but the same content is never going to be shared twice, really. Mobile offers a very, very different prospect. So first off, mobile as a platform, it's both personal, intimate, private, but also social. So you can, there's loads of experiments being done to give BBC a hat tip on this one in using apps like WhatsApp for actually delivering news to communities and stuff. India being case in point, to try and stem a huge misinformation campaign that's broken out in India. But on top of that, obviously, we have all the social platforms for good or bad. And again, I think that's a topic we'll probably unpack somewhat a little bit later. But the key thing for me is that there are probably 2 billion of those smartphones out there now. And that gives us a really unique opportunity to reach niche audiences and to dip deeper into hyperlocal news and communities and interest groups who, if you're a public service broadcaster, you're duty bound to serve. But the business model that we work on really, really struggles to do that. The pipeline and the way we make news is not really designed to go down to a hyperlocal level. It's designed to fill the slots that we have on news every single day to the highest possible technical standard that we can. Now, I'm sure you all know this and may well be preaching to the converted, but the little device that's in your pocket right now that you will probably give up a finger before you would actually part with it, it's capable of a hell of a lot more than you're likely using it for. And to be fair, there's been a swathe of different broadcasters who have experimented with using mobile phones for content acquisition right across the media gamut, from radio, in newspapers, TV broadcasters, and obviously online goes without saying. But I've like Guy, I've trained lots of different companies and lots of different entities in how to leverage smartphones. And they're often quite taken aback when they see the workflows and the different apps that you can potentially use at the quality that you can generate. There's a rather unfair association with smartphones that the quality is really, really awful because loads of user-generated content is awful, but that's not the phone's fault. That's the person holding the phone's fault. So think of it, if you will, as a smartphone being like the ultimate pocket tool, and you always have it with you. So the real thing that I've been trying to advocate, and I think Guy is on the same page as me to some extent, is trying to make sure that people know what the hell to do with this amazing bloody tool that they have in their pocket, because just using it for the one blade when you have all that other stuff on it is really, really defeating the purpose. Okay. So your phone alone is a competent device. But over the last 10 years, since, you know, the launch, if you like, of the iPhone in particular, subsequently Android, there's been an explosion in the mobile ecosystem. There are loads of accessories on the market now. I mean, I could literally do about 70 pages of specific accessories that you can get for smartphones right now. We could be here until the weekend. The point about it is that there's just a couple of fundamental bases that you need to check to make sure that the actual, you know, that the production quality goes as high as it possibly can. This is if you're using mobile for broadcast. So a competent tripod, some way to put that phone on the tripod that makes sure the phone is protected and safe, because it is quite an investment in its own right. Good audio, don't compromise in the audio. So there's lots of solutions out there from big brands like Shure and Sennheiser and Rode, Deity. There's loads of them. Lights, small little portable LED lights now, which are even waterproof, can run for several hours on a single charge, will only set you back about £75. And then, you know, there are extra accessories that you could include into it as well that go a little bit beyond just the phone. Now, just to give you ballpark numbers, that kit, including the phone, I've put it in euros, sorry, but, you know, so that's about £2,750 sterling for what you see on screen, including the phone. If you were to decide to throw the kitchen sink at it from production values, for an extra £1,500, you could be airborne with a nice DJI drone, potentially, GoPro, slider, gimbal, nice leather bag to carry it all around in. We're still not breaking the bank, certainly not compared to the 60,000 euros for an ENG kit. We're spending about €4,500, around £4,000 to kit up someone to be able to do very diverse news gathering with consumer kit. Now, all of the kit that I'm showing you right now is kit that's capable of shooting at 4K resolution. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So the technical arguments to a certain extent fall back. I know we can talk about bit rates and color space, and there may well be engineers on the call here who want to come back at me about that, and you're welcome to do so, but I'll give you my first world experience of it as well. So let's look at the business model. There is our ENG kits, and those are, you know, dedicated, incredibly creative, talented people whose beating heart basically revolves around news. But there's not enough of them. in any typical newsroom, the ratio between camera crews and editors to journalists is probably in the region of sort of 7 to 1. So you get one camera person roughly every 7 journalists. And that creates a bottleneck, naturally. So back in 2001, I was involved with the introduction of video journalism into RTE. We were shooting on initially DV cameras, subsequently EX3s and so on. Then back in around 2011, 2012, I started bringing in mobile journalism into the newsroom. And if you just look at the business case, imagine next time you go to your capital acquisition panel, you're about to spend X amount of million on ENG kits. If you were to hold back just the cost of one ENG kit, I'm not saying fire the cameraman. I'm not saying get rid of the cameraman. I'm not that guy. But if you were to just hold back the budget from one kit, you could basically deploy an awful lot of extremely high level mobile journalists. This is looking at the gear again with that same investment. So you're empowering multiple more people for storytelling to create content, which can be used not just on social media, not just on the website, but it can very competently be broadcast as well. And if you weren't to give them the all bells and whistles kit, if you're to give them the basic kit, well, you can double that number. Now that's a lot of bodies out in the field, dipping into communities, developing beats, visiting kind of niche community groups and so on and so forth. And their content could be shared locally, regionally, or nationally, depending on the value of the story. But they don't have to compromise on the quality of the production. In fact, I would argue, based on the experiments that we did in RTE, that the average member of the audience has not got a single clue that the footage that they're watching on screen is shot by a phone if you follow a set of predefined rules. So I'll put all this in a nutshell. I'm nearly at the end of this. Ultimately, from my perspective, I believe that we're at a pivot, and I believe COVID has to a certain extent forced the hands of a lot of the broadcasters who've been forced to get their staff to work from home because of quarantine restrictions. They've been forced to empower their journalists to work remotely. And more, thankfully to me, I think my business has thrived this year because I'm training an lot of journalists how to basically leverage their mobile devices. We're moving towards a virtualized newsroom. And there's already experiments going on out there in this regard, but we are very, very quickly coming to the point that we have a sustainable model that could scale very, very quickly. Now, what might it look like? 2 slides from the end. It could look like this.
Some of my closest friends and family say they're not taking the COVID-19 vaccine because they believe it contains aborted baby fetuses.
Or it could look like this.
Mark Boyle may have ditched technology, but he's never felt more connected. Connected when he's collecting water from the local spring.
Yeah, this is where I get my water from.
I'll just leave it at that. I can send links and share stuff afterwards, anyone interested. The content that you just saw, the latter piece, is a television story shot by one of my colleagues, former colleagues in RT, Philip Bromwell. It was entirely produced on mobile, shot on an iPhone using an app called Filmic Pro, edited completely on an iPad using an app called LumaFusion. It was sent in, transcoded from Progressive to Interlace and broadcast seamlessly. And it is absolutely doable because the phones are capable of shooting either HD at 1080 50 megs or 4K at 100 megabits per second if you really want to push the boundaries. While it's never going to be broadcast in 4K, well, not in RT for the foreseeable future anyway, you shoot 4K, you can reversion very, very quickly. You can basically dive straight in, you can crop into that 4K master shot and reversion vertical, square, or widescreen seamlessly. I'll skip forward on the technical spec stuff, but there's just one final point I want to leave, which is this report from Forbes came out in the last couple of days. It is rumor, may not be true, though a few developers I've spoken to in the last 24 hours suggest that in fact this is definitely in the pipeline. It basically means that the next iPhone is now likely to have what they're referring to as portrait video. What the hell is portrait video? It is computer augmented shallow depth of field. So you know what portrait mode looks like in photographs. Well, with the new processing power and the LiDAR sensor and the next generation iPhone, it will be able to implement that for video. And if you look at the last few words of the sentence, this is the bit I'm quite excited about. The depth of field can be modified in post. So it'll be doing depth mapping and storing all that depth information. This, for me, is the final Rubicon when it comes to mobile adoption, because finally, the aesthetic will start to resemble higher end production. And I think it's a real pivot point. Last 2 slides, there's quite a few broadcasters around Europe who've experimented in mobile. RT should probably be on there somewhere, oops. But the ones I do want to give a shout out to wrap up is YLE in Finland. So during COVID, YLE has deployed a swathe of mobile journalists across their entire network, and they are generating, they were awarded a EBU Technology and Innovation Award for this, over 250 pieces of content per month are being generated by mobile journalists right across Finland, all via mobile. This, for me, this is one of the best case studies I've seen so far. So that's it. I'm going to wrap it up. But I guess the punchline for the Rye sign-off guy is we can't solve a problem with the same thinking. Very much, I think, what Guy said as well. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Glenn. So we're not now going to be looking so much at invention as innovation. By that, I mean, it's not about the new things as so much as new ways of using things that we already have. Not talking about OTT, because that works in pretty much the same way as everyone else, i.e. you buy or make content and then sell it or give it free to audiences. The content aggregates audience eyeballs that then get rented to advertisers. This or something like it is the usual business model. But there are others. We've seen the rise of social media in the form of online text blogs, video and audio vlogs and podcasts. Ad revenue, crowdfunding and sponsorship produce new business models. And this is one of the furry balls. YouTube is the biggest of these and hosts millions of creators who thrive by making content that serves niche audiences. So now we're going to have a sort of open discussion. So we've seen 19 forced a lot of choices for a lot of changes. Is this a sign of the disruption to come, or is there some hope of returning to normal? Guy?
I think, I mean, some things I think will return to normal. I mean, I was struck by, I think, the boss of Goldman Sachs. There was a story about him this morning saying he thought people working from home was an aberration. Yeah, right. These were the guys who got it right in 2008. Sounds like this is a guy heading for a fall again, but he's got a bigger paycheck than me, so maybe he's right. But I think some things will return to normal. I mean, Glenn was talking there about the spike in TV viewing during the pandemic, and I think, you know, I think that is a spike which will go away, and the remorseless decline will continue. I think some of the technical innovations that have happened over the last year in order to work remotely, I think they will stay. I mean, some of the ways that broadcasters have come up with, where essentially I was much struck with a colleague of mine told me today that they had they sent a crew to do a shoot in Africa, a conventional crew, not with a smartphone, conventional crew with a reporter, a producer, and a camera operator. They did the shoot, and then they all jumped on a plane and went back home. And back home for them, the reporter was based in Europe, the camera operator was based in Asia, and the producer was based in Africa. But they were all able to collaborate on making a number of pieces, even though they were in different continents, different time zones. And I think that kind of thing just won't go away. In some ways, the scales have fallen from people's eyes. And I think because of the pressure of the pandemic has forced innovation in the same way as, you know, a war forces innovation. People just have to do it. The usual arguments and the endless bloody meetings about, you know, what you should do suddenly go away because you've just got to get it done. And I think a lot of that will stay with us.
There's quite a lot of talk about how the media is fragmenting these days as slices of the pie get smaller and smaller. There's less money about to do what is really a very expensive thing. Broadcast is massively expensive. You've got to comply with regulations. You're limited to regional areas, etc. And we now have other models. We have a rise of YouTube channels that are no longer just cats doing funny things or teenagers exploring existential angst in their bedrooms. We have proper channels doing interesting news. I mean, the BBC's there, all of the broadcasters are there, but also there are others joining that, and they're beginning to create a foothold in this medium. So how is that going? What do you think of that, Glenn?
I think what's really, really interesting, actually, if you think about what YouTube and Google, if you like, in particular, are doing in relation to news. So I think there's a larger underlying trend that you need to be mindful of. So if you look what's happening in Australia, where the government is trying to introduce a law, obviously, to make the big social media brands pay for the use of the content that the local media companies are creating. what Google has done, and they've been doing it not just recently, this has been running for 5 or 6 years, is their News Lab initiative funds multi-million euros worth of investment basically in news research every year. And a lot of those kind of initiatives and those funding projects lead to kind of these projects that, like TLDR and the others that you mentioned, may not have been directly availing of that, but they certainly would be on a scale of some of the other projects that Google has funded. So they're putting research and development in to almost try and create a platform and encourage people to come to their platform, but bring one key USP with them, which is credibility. And this for me is the crux of the whole story. So as a lot of people would look at YouTube, for instance, traditionally, as you say, cats, funny videos. When you start to look at the professional side of it and you start to say, well, you could start up an actual fully credible and sustainable news service just based on YouTube, as long as you have Google support. I'll come back to that in a second. And it would take out all the infrastructure costs related to broadcast potentially from your production. This is where mobile definitely has a huge opportunity, because that's there for the taking right now and has been like that for some time. But the thing that really troubles me in some way, as someone who spent 20 years in a traditional broadcast television news environment, is that, to go back to Guy's point earlier about innovation and people's attitude towards change, you know, the classic line, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That has always been the way that the newsroom worked. They didn't want to adopt change because it was seen as risky, disruptive. It could challenge people's credibility on air, it could damage the brand. All those reasons basically were part of the reason for being quite protective and I suppose conservative about adopting change. But COVID has forced their hand. So I know part of the team that I used to work with had to pivot from literally having all the team in the newsroom, having the production team in the gallery to basically create the news, to switching on remote control of the vision mixing system and everything else, and the vision mixer directing from home. It is unthinkable. If I was to have pitched that 4 years ago before I left as a concept, I would have probably been fired or laughed out of the building by the unions. But yet it is possible. And now people really have to stand back and say, okay, yes, concessions may well have been made, but there are different ways of doing things, and different ways that are more cost efficient and that don't compromise on the key USP, which is the trust and the verification that comes with the official news organizations. That is the USP, not the camera that we use to make that story, not the infrastructure that we deliver that story on, but the bloody story. And the problem is we have, to a certain extent, for way too long, compromised on the stories that we tell in order to fulfill the broader picture of the kind of very, very high level production values that have been required for news to date.
Sorry, Guy, you can say something?
Well, I was also, just really touching on Glenn's point about trust. Today I was reading a piece which I think the Reuters Institute put together about an operation in New Zealand, which I didn't know about, but until today. But Stuff Media, and apparently they are the biggest online presence in New Zealand. Forgive me if there are any Kiwis in the audience who know better than me, but essentially what the piece was about was the fact that essentially this organisation had ditched Facebook as a means of pushing their stuff out, and obviously lots of organisations are seriously a bit scared about doing that kind of thing because they're worried that their audience figures are going to tank. And one of the reasons that that this organisation ditched Facebook is that they really didn't like the way Facebook dealt with the Christchurch massacre. Remember that, when the killer was able to live stream his kill, and they were deeply unimpressed with the way that Facebook dealt with that. Went to the heart of the trust issue that Glenn was referring to. And so as a result, this company has now decided to move away from Facebook, essentially to drop Facebook, which in many ways is a brave decision. But what they're saying is, okay, it's a bit of a strange year because of COVID, but they haven't really suffered badly from it. In fact, they could, taking COVID out of the mix, the impact was neutral, which is a win. So it goes to the heart of the trust thing and the technology thing, I think.
So one of the things I've been noticing is that there is a growth of an alternative to official news. And it's occurring mainly on YouTube, where people are quite deliberately creating channels. The Young Turks in America have moved on to YouTube. They started in the early 2000s, but So I think it was probably 2018, 17, something like that. A young lad called Jack Kelly, who's in his early 20s, started Too Long Didn't Read, a news channel for Generation Z. He seems to have an authentic voice, and authenticity of voice seems to be what's valued on YouTube more than, shall we say, professional presentation, etc. And he, on TLDR, he creates explainer videos, and they seem to go down very well. He has about 5 million viewers. He's paying for it partly through AdSense revenue, which YouTube is relatively generous in the split, the revenue split, but they're also using crowdfunding sites like Patreon. And there does seem to be a substantial wave of these sites of sustainable channels that are growing and thriving. So given that we hear that journalism is somewhat less trusted around the same sort of level as politicians and estate agents, do you think this authenticity of voice is going to create a new surge of the way in which we process the news?
Can I take that, Guy? Just
By all means, Glenn.
So I think it's slightly a double-edged sword, Simon. I think I would actually applaud his initiative in actually doing that. I've looked at the service, and the quality of the production is actually exceptionally good. It's all motion graphic design, but extremely well editorially considered and balanced. And that, to a certain extent, is a real positive. But the problem is there's no editorial regulation or oversight to say if tomorrow he gets a big sponsorship deal that he doesn't declare, his editorial line could go way left of center and no one's going to call him out on it except perhaps his Patreon followers. If you want to amplify that and flip it on its head, just look at what happened in America over the last 4 years when you have, when you have news organizations don't have to worry about impartiality or bias. So I think to a certain extent, I think the audience will perhaps respond to the editorial brief, but the risk of that is that it creates echo chambers where you only start to hear the news that you kind of want to hear rather than hearing the broad scope of it and hearing both sides of the argument. I still believe that the big broadcasters could have a presence in that same space and could be creating bespoke content for the audience that he's reaching with TLDR. The question I would pose to you, and I'd love to debate this, is do you think the people that are watching TLDR are the same demographic as those sitting down to watch the BBC News on television in the evenings?
Yeah,
Probably not, but there are 5 million of them.
Yeah.
And that's on one of his channels. He has a network, and the Young Turks are sorry, no, it's not 5 million. It's getting on for 1 million. The Young Turks have got 5 million across on one of their channels. Mm-hmm. But these things have a way of growing. There's the entertainment channels like Mr. Beast, who has whatever it is, 50 million. He's the guy that gives money away. Mm-hmm. He stands as a Uber driver and then gives the car to the passenger. Stuff like that, which is all very entertaining, but not particularly informative. So,
Simon, if I could sort of jump in there, I think actually the problem that the public service broadcasters have is exactly the point you're raising there. Essentially, the audience is splintering on the one hand, but on the other hand, the point that Glenn made, who sits down to watch the 6 o'clock news? I mean, they all pay their license fee. So the problem that any PSB has at the moment is having to ride 2 horses at the same time with the same bucket of cash. Okay, they've got, in comparison to an organization like TLDR, shed loads of cash in comparison, but they're having to ride multiple horses at the same time because, it's not as if you can suddenly put all your money on black, the online market and expect it to come up, because you're going to annoy the hell out of a vast tranche of your viewers and listeners who are expecting what they've always had. So on the one hand, you have to deal with the splintering. On the other hand, you've got to sort of keep on those 2 horses.
You mentioned echo chambers earlier, Glenn. Mm-hmm. And don't we have that already? I mean, there are people who read The Guardian and nothing else, and people who read The Telegraph and nothing else, and they have different perspectives on the same truth, which add up to a different meaning. that the truth means something else. So don't we already have this echo chamber problem?
We do, but when you look at the Guardian or the Telegraph, whichever you're a reader of, or maybe you read both, which would be good to hear, but equally you have editorial boards and oversight in both. Okay, so there are some level of checks and balances and controls that call whatever it is that's published into accountability. The problem when you look at platforms like Facebook or YouTube is that that layer simply doesn't exist. And not only does it not exist, but the platforms themselves are innately distancing themselves from any responsibility regarding that. In fact, is that not part of the crux of what happened in the US? I think somewhere in the mid ground between the two, there is room for the big traditional trustworthy PSB broadcasters to use innovation as a motivation to start to explore other demographics and other business models that could be sustainable and reach an audience that they may perhaps are not reaching at the moment, but without throwing out the baby with the bathwater and, you know, necessarily curtailing anything in the traditional television output for now anyway. This is going to be a transitional period that runs probably 10 years, if not more. We're into it already, but it's certainly still in its infancy. But at the same time, the absence of credible voice in those platforms has basically amplified those echo chambers. It's allowed more polarization, more fake news to basically spread unchecked. And that, I think, is to a certain extent where there's an opportunity to basically put a very substantial footprint into that market with a bespoke news service that's not recycling what was on television just on a social platform, but telling stories that are specifically bespoke for both the audience demographic and for the platform.
Right, I would like to ask anyone in the any of the attendees, any of the delegates to tonight, if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat or raise your hand and we'll bring you in. Maybe to start it off, what sort of skills do you think are needed going forward into the future? I mean, we used to have, as you say, disappearance of the specialist. Does it mean that we have, I mean, people have to dilute their skills to become a generalist or what?
Do you want to take that, Glenn?
I'll rock, paper, scissors you there, Guy, on that one. It's okay. I'll give a truncated answer and let Guy come in this one as well. But for me, multi-skilling has been prevalent since I gave you the example of the desktop editing back in 1996. It's not a new phenomenon. So we kind of need to just accept that that's a thing now. Okay. Video journalism has been around since 1994. It's a thing. I'm not saying everyone necessarily has an aptitude for it, but I think the beauty of mobile phones is that it has simplified the process substantially. When I was teaching people to use video journalism cameras back in 2001, 2002, it was still a fairly complicated process that required a lot of technical skill. With a mobile phone, you can have that level, but you can also just switch on the automation and still get bloody good results. In fairness, just look at Instagram photography and you'll see that, you know, smartphone photographs look pretty damn good just by simply pointing and pressing the button. So to a certain extent, you could actually have a sliding scale of skills. You don't need to compromise in quality, though that is the key. And at the end of the day, let's not get bogged down in the technical thing, because the editorial value is where the key emphasis is. That is the essence that we can't afford to lose. And as long as they're professional journalists, we should not need to compromise in that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, there are some people, and you know, that I've worked with, and I'm sure we've all worked with, who are, you know, natural born storytellers. They're instinctively brilliant reporters who have just an unerring ability to get to the heart of things. And there are other people who are equally as good, but they just have to work hard at it, and perhaps they're not as naturally instinctively gifted. So to a certain extent, you know, there is the horses for courses argument. Some people are better at certain things than others. But all I would say to you is, you know, back when in my presentation, I just put up a still of a TikTok screen. You know, that's multi-skilling right there on your smartphone. Everything that you would ever want to do, you would ever want to create a 30-second clip for TikTok is there. And, you know, you don't have to have gone to college. You don't have to have, you know, done an expensive MA in broadcast journalism. It's all there. And the people that I think that the younger people who are coming into broadcasting media generally, this is the water they swim in. You know, I mean, we don't have to explain it to them. They just kind of get it. And it's kind of embarrassing sometimes just how fluent they are at this stuff.
We haven't even grasped machine learning and how artificial intelligence is going to shake up that automation as well. Like, we're at the cusp of that. That's the Wild West right now. But in the next 3 to 4 years, like, the entire process of making content will potentially be automated using millions of hours of content being basically aggregated, analyzed, and come up into production models that you can, give me an art noir type story. Click, there you go. It's rendered, graded, and spat back out by a machine somewhere. It's scary what's coming, to be honest.
And then you'll have an algorithm as well, which will serve it up to to the people who've already expressed an interest in that kind of thing. And the echo chamber that you were referring to, Simon, then is accentuated still further, because that's what social media is there for, is to serve up stuff that you like and keep on serving it to you until you just you surf it and you go somewhere else or switch off or go to sleep or whatever.
At the top of the webinar, we have a question here. At the top of the webinar, you showed a picture of the new BBC's integrated newsroom guide. To what extent do you think it's already out of date?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, some of the things that drove it, i.e. the sort of integration across radio, TV, online, the ability of journalists to operate seamlessly across all media. I think that kind of premise still holds good. I mean, I guess the point is, do you need a vast, expensive pile in the middle of London to do it from? And the answer there is, COVID has shown shown the future, in the sense that no, you don't need to all be in the same place at the same time to achieve all that, and you don't need to worry about everybody having their own personal workspace. I mean, that was a trend that was already existing before the BBC moved into its shiny new building. There were not enough seats in the building for everybody who was going to work there, deliberately so, because it wasn't that kind of building. Is it completely redundant as an? No, I don't think it is. If you are, but I think the future is clear. A lot of the technology which is currently in big, plumbed in app rooms is going to migrate to the cloud. People will be able to use it wherever they are. They'll be able to tap into it wherever they are, as long as they've got bandwidth to do that. I mean, and you're not going to get that in some parts of the world. But I think it's buildings like that are not going to disappear overnight. I think it's an evolutionary thing, not a revolutionary thing. But I think, during this pandemic, I think we've had a look at the future and how it might be. And, the number of technical workarounds that news organizations have come up with, I think will just drive that process further and further. But is NBH redundant? No, it isn't yet.
I've got a question here from the audience. It's about getting started. We know that newsrooms are getting smaller. There are fewer journalists now being run out of newsrooms, etc. So, for somebody who wants to get involved, is it worth starting on a free platform like YouTube to build up your skills and perhaps a following?
My personal take on it would be that the benefit of YouTube is that obviously you build up a library very, very quickly. So it's discoverable, it's searchable, second biggest search engine on the planet, and potentially the option to monetize. Those are the benefits. The downside is you're contending with bazillions of hours of other content as well. So you have to find your audience. Last year I had a chance to speak to a couple of very, very successful vloggers as part of a program I was involved in, like Super Saf and iJustine and others. And there was one message that kept coming back from all of them, which is when they got started, they needed to find their passion, something that it's a job, by the way, it's not just a hobby. So you got to find your passion so you can stay committed to it. 2, you've got to identify your tribe. So find out who are the audience that you're targeting, find out where they are, and then give them the stuff that you think they're going to watch wherever they are. So rather than trying to navel gaze on what you think might be best, there's a bit of market research to be done up front to identify who your demographic is. But the benefit of YouTube, like I say, is the fact that there is the monetization layer. And there's a lot of very, very powerful creator tools in there. The downside is, again, if you speak to some of the successful vloggers, every now and again, YouTube tweak one of those monetization policies or acceptable use policies or something, and overnight you could get a massive hit to your revenue stream that you've zero control over, and really no way of, you know, kind of claim that back. So I do think we're getting to the point, if you look at the iteration in technology that's happened just in the last few months alone, with the launch of Clubhouse, soon Twitter Spaces, and these other new audio discussion platforms, I think there will be innovation in serving out content as well, probably on a new social platform. I think I'm probably going to get into trouble for saying this, but I think Facebook has become so toxic that there is definitely a screaming argument for a platform that has much better oversight, probably built on blockchain with lots of stakeholders that can try and keep it editorially balanced. Anytime soon, please. Can't come soon enough.
I think but I think one of the issues is that we were talking about trust earlier. I mean, people don't walk into broadcasting, into media with automatically with a set of skills that allows them to deliver trusted content. I mean, I look back to some of the stuff that I did when I was starting out, and had the benefit of subs and editors who knew a lot more than I did and would stop me doing really stupid things. If I had walked in and today and set up my own YouTube channel and gone, I would have done all those stupid things, because there wouldn't have been anybody telling me, there wouldn't have been any red lines. And that's one thing that does worry me in terms of, you know, where are the trusted guides of tomorrow coming from? You know, an influencer on YouTube for me doesn't quite cut it, partly because you don't necessarily know where they're coming from. There are organizations like TLDR, the Young Turks you talked about, also Vice News a little while back, which kind of did start moving in that direction. But, you know, that's one thing that really worries me. You know, as the death of the slow death, if you like, of the established people who provide the training, who provide the experience, provide the space for people to make mistakes. You know, where's that going to come from in the future? Mm.
Well, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this topic. But I'd like to thank both Glenn and Guy for such useful insights into a phenomenon that's going to impact everyone in the media one way or another. At the RTS Thames Valley Technology Centre, we aim to explore things that matter to the industry, to you. Please follow us on Twitter at RTS Thames Valley, or Google us, RTS Thames Valley, to hear more. Thanks for being with us tonight.